President Trump said, quote, "I do believe I will be having the honor of taking Cuba." He also said, "I could do anything I want with it if you want to know the truth." What is your reaction to some of the rhetoric that we've heard from the President of the United States?
Well, you know, during the last 3 months, almost every day, President Trump or Secretary of State Marco Rubio said something like this: friendly takeover, we are negotiating, we are not negotiating, we are ready to bomb and destroy everything. And for us, we have been our position is clear crystal. You know, our president announced last Friday that we recently started a dialogue between officials of the Cuban government and officials of the US government based on equal footing, respect of sovereignty, respect of independence, and respect of not interference in internal affairs. So that means that takeover, friendly takeover, regime change, remove of the President Miguel Diaz-Canel are completely out of any dialogue, because that means interfering in the internal affair, and we said very clear that the conversations are based on not interference in internal affairs.
Well, let's get into some of that. So we heard from the President that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is the person talking to the Cuban government. Mm-hmm. Who is talking to him on the Cuban side? What can you tell us about the talks that have happened so far?
I don't know. I have not the answer for this question, but I insist. The most important issue is it doesn't matter who is talking, where they are talking, when they are talking. The most important issue is that we have the opportunity to have a dialogue based on mutual respect, that we had it in the past, and it gave us good results for both parts.
At this moment, what is the best outcome for you, for Cuba, from those talks? What do you hope comes out of them?
Well, you know, as we also said, we are, as part of this dialogue, we are identifying the issues, the main issues where we have difference. So once we identify those issues, we are in a position to find solutions for those different. And at the same time, we are in a position also to identify areas where we can cooperate in benefit of mutual part, because usually people talk that a conversation between Cuba and the US is only beneficial for Cuba, and it is not. It's beneficial for both parts, like we proved in the past. We have some different areas, migration issues. I was reading right now that a news said that a new flight with the Cuban deportees landed today in Cuba. That is
came from the U.S. to Cuba.
Came from the U.S. So that is part of our cooperation in the migration issue. We signed in the past 3 different agreements on migration issues. So this is one of the areas where we can cooperate. But we can cooperate also in the combating the drug trafficking, for example. This is another area. In the past, we cooperate in the health sector. Some U.S. institutions and Cuban institutions sign agreements to cooperate in the health sector. Again, beneficial for both parts. So for me, the best outcome of this dialogue is to identify different areas where we can cooperate, and from that point, to be able to build a new kind of relation between Cuba and the U.S.
You talked about what's on the table and what isn't. So we had the Secretary of State saying Cuba has to put new people in charge. Is Cuba willing to make changes to senior leadership to appease the United States?
Not at all. As I told you, this is the only people that has the right to elect our leadership is the Cuban people. So no one will come to tell us you have to do this or to that in this regard, you know. So it is part of, we are not asking the US that they have to change their leadership. So it's an issue of independence, you know. We are an independent country, and no one can tell us what we can do in this regard. This is something that we have to get by ourselves.
You alluded to this. The New York Times reported that the U.S. told your president he would have to step aside for there to be talks going forward. The Secretary of State has disputed that. Did that happen? Did the U.S. make that request or demand ahead of these talks?
This is something that you have to ask to the leadership of the U.S., you know, but what I'm sure is that those issues are not in the table right now.
Your president said this earlier this week. Any external aggressor will encounter una resistencia inexpugnable, an indomitable resistance. Your job at the UN is to explain to the world the policies of your government. What does an indomitable resistance from Cuba look like?
That means that we are ready for any scenarios. You know, we really want to have this dialogue. It is not a new position of the Cuban government. It is a very long-standing position of the Cuban government that we consider that the best option for both parts is to have a different kind of relation, you know. So, and we are open to talk about everything. We are not telling that we can talk about everything based on what I told you, not interfere in internal affairs. But if you want to talk about human rights, we are ready to talk about human rights. The U.S. government has concern about human rights in Cuba. Okay, we have concern also about human rights in the U.S. Something happens in Minnesota or in some other area, so we can talk about this. If you want to talk about democracy, we are ready to talk about democracy also with the U.S. government, you know. But so this is our position. But at the same time, we are ready for some other scenarios because we suffer aggression from the U.S. government in the past, so we know about that, and we have to be ready for it. So when the president said that, that means that we are ready to talk. This is our main position. But if someone try to invade Cuba, or if someone try to make an aggression to Cuba, they will find the whole people, 10 million people, ready to defend our sovereignty, our independence, without it not taking into account the cost. We told in the past, we prefer to disappear before, as a nation, before to go back to what he had in 1959, before 1959, who was a government that do what the U.S. government said.
Let's talk a bit about the oil blockade that's been in place. The last shipment that you got of oil was in January. That came from Mexico. Before that, in December, you got a shipment from Venezuela. Of course, circumstances have changed. You used to rely on 25,000 barrels a day from Venezuela. That's gone. What has the impact of that, the oil blockade imposed by the United States, been on the country of Cuba over these last couple of months?
It has a huge impact. The first question here is, the government of the U.S. has the right to impose a blockade like this? Do they have the right to set third countries that they can sell or not oil to Cuba? I think that they have not this right, and this is not. They are violating the international law, the international humanitarian law, the Charter of the UN, the rules of the foreign trade. So they are. But the worst issue is that it is not only with Cuba. I just read a news yesterday that said that if they don't get a good deal on the precious minerals in Africa, they will do something horrible to Africa. So, and they said that to Greenland and whatever. So, but it has, imagine which country in this world could work without receiving a single liter of oil in the last 3 months. Right now, we have around 96,000 patients in a waiting list for surgery. Not urgent surgeries, because we are doing urgent surgery, but we have 96,000 people that are waiting for a surgery because we don't have electricity or oil to have electricity in the hospital. Around 11,000 of them children. We have more than 30,000 women, pregnant women, waiting for an ultrasound because also lack of electricity. But you need electricity to produce food. You need electricity to pump water. You need electricity for food transportation, to transport people. You need electricity for almost everything. So here, David, we are looking at a collective punishment to a whole country just because another country, they want to change the government of Cuba. So and this is not a new strategy. Since 1960, Lester Mallory, at that time Under Secretary of State of the United States, said the only way that they have to take over Cuba is to create a situation like this that we are suffering right now.
How long is the current situation sustainable? So we're on the heels of another long blackout, national blackout in Cuba. You describe the difficulty in the medical sector, in the hospital sector, difficulty with food shortages. How long can Cuba go on with this blockade in place?
If I tell you how long it for us could be, we are ready to face a situation like this for a long, long time. We are resilient people. For example, right now, we are generating in a day, we are generating about 50% of the electricity from renewable resource, solar panels. We are increasing our oil production. Our oil is very heavy, so we need to refine it, but we are working on that. We are working also to install solar panels in those critical facilities, like hospital, like schools, like some research center. And at the same time, we are working with our partner, with the rest of the countries of the world, to try and to find a solution for this situation. Even the UN system, it is also working on that, because they realize that this is not not for Cuba, but for no one. This is not a fair situation. This is not something that's supposed to happen in the 21st century.
We've reported there are 2 tankers carrying Russian crude headed for Cuba, one that's slated to arrive by the end of the month, another one that had been diverted and is now apparently going back to Cuba. Are you optimistic that those vessels will make it to the island? And indeed, what would happen if the Trump administration were to prevent or try to prevent those ships from getting to Cuba?
I read same news. I hope that that some oil arrive in Cuba, from Russia, from Mexico, from whatever. But I hope so. And I no doubt that if something like this happens, the situation, the impact of this humanitarian situation will be much better. Right now, we have installed 1,400 kilowatts in power plants that are ready to produce electricity. And they cannot produce electricity because we don't have oil. So imagine that if we receive oil, we can reduce this waiting list of surgery that I mentioned. We can start to work properly. In terms right now, we have to reorganize our education system. We have to reorganize our transportation system. So if we receive something like this, it will be very helpful for us. But if not, as I told you, David, we will keep working and keep looking for a solution for our problem. We don't have any other option.
The Secretary of State says the Cuban economy is non-functional. Would you agree with that? Maybe you wouldn't be glad about that, but given what you're describing, the difficulty in healthcare, the difficulty with food and with medicine, the fact that you can't get oil to the country, is it a non-functional economy at this point?
Imagine that you are running a country where you have been suffering a blockade or embargo for the last 60 years. That means that you don't receive any kind of credit. That means that they cancel ESTA visas for European citizens just because they visit Cuba as a tourist. That means that they push third countries to cancel health cooperation program with Cuba. All of these issues are source of income for the Cuban government. But take a look of this short period that we had an engagement policy with Cuba. Cuba became the overall wild destination for cruise ship companies based in Florida.
This was during the Obama administration.
This was the second term of Obama, between 2015 and 2017. You know, we had this flow of visitors from the U.S. to Cuba. We start small and medium private business in Cuba. Business companies in the U.S. started to make business with Cuban companies. And do you know, the life of the Cuban people was much, much better. The flow of migrants, of Cuban people to the U.S. were going down. Why? Because they had a future in Cuba. And at that time, they even removed the embargo. They just made some kind of a change in terms of the relation between Cuba and the U.S. They allow American people to visit Cuba. They allow American companies to make business with Cuba. They allow American companies to have a cooperation project with Cuba. Just with that, the economy situation in Cuba was improving significantly. So my point is, if they really know, if they really believe that Cuba's economy it doesn't work, why do they need to impose an embargo or an oil blockade to Cuba? If we are a failure government, we will fail by ourselves. Why do you need to impose some sanctions like this to have this to prove that we are a failure economy?
This gets to a question I wanted to ask you about a change that's been announced this week. So Cubans living overseas can now invest in Cuban businesses. They can start Cuban banks and non-bank institutions. And you were, I'm going to check your title here to make sure I get it right, Director General of the General Division of Consular Affairs and Cuban Residents Abroad in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before you took this job. Why is this change happening now? And what is the goal of the Cuban government to relax this restriction on Cuban expatriates being able to invest in Cuba?
First of all, we have to say that this is part of a process. You know, a process that started in 1979, when the later president of Cuba, Fidel Castro, convened a conference between Cuba and the Cuban living abroad at that time. And from that moment, we have been increasing and improving the relation between Cuba and the Cuban living abroad. So it is not something that we say, okay, now we are going to start to work with the Cuban people. They have been working with us, and we have been working with the Cuban people for a long, long time. And someone asked me just a few days ago about timing. And I said, it is not an issue of timing, because Cubans are able, for example, not for now, for many years ago, they were able to make business in Cuba. Now they can invest, but before they were able to have business with Cuba. You know, if you have a company, they have the opportunity to make business with Cuba. But the problem is that how are you going to invest? How are you going to make business if you cannot open a bank account here in the US? How are you going to do that if you cannot make transactions, financial transactions, from this country to Cuba? How are you going to do that if once you produce something in Cuba, you cannot import to the US? How are you going to do that if you cannot export something to Cuba if you don't request a specific license before? So the point is that Cuba can do as much as we want, as much as we can, and at the end of the day, the Cuban people, they will not be able to implement those business, not because of Cuba, but because the regulation of the U.S. Government.
The Trump administration says this isn't a dramatic enough change. I think members of the Cuban exile community, and they're not a monolith, of course, would say you can do this, but you should also be increasing free expression, making political change, allowing political prisoners to be released. All of that has to happen at once. If it doesn't all happen at once, are you confident that still it will result in hard currency moving from places like Miami and Madrid back to Cuba?
Yes, sure. And we had also this experience 8 years ago. When the US government decided to implement an engaged policy, a lot of Cubans that live here in the US, but also that live around the world, they start to support this kind of policy because they don't. This policy has specific sanctions, but it is not only the sanctions, but also the environment to threat people. No one can, I cannot tell you, if you are an European citizen and you travel to Cuba, they will cancel your ESTA visa. But it is a possibility. So, like it is a possibility, you prefer not to travel because you don't want to go through this risk. So something similar happens with the Cuban people. If they see that there are an engagement policy, that there are an environment that don't punish them because they do something like this, they are going to do it because they did it in the past. Because Cuban migrants are like the rest of the migrants all over around the world. What is the natural behavior of the migrant? They send remittance to their families in the homeland. They travel to their homeland to visit their family, relative, friends. They make business with the companies in their homeland because they know their homeland. They know the language. They know the system. But in the case of Cuba, we have a very important difference that families in Cuba, if we have an engagement policy, they have some privilege that some other migrants have it all over around the world. A free healthcare system. So you don't need to send money to your family in Cuba to pay for a doctor because the Cuban government granted a free health system. A free education system. So you don't need to send money to your people in Cuba to study it. They have the right to study it without paid a cent. During the COVID, I was at that time the director, as you said, of consular affairs. And when we had conversation with our counterparts in different countries, they recognize that the Cuban migrants arrive in their country already vaccinated against COVID. None other migrant has this kind of so my point is that Cuban migrants like, or they like than the rest of the migrants all over around the world. They want to have this fluent relation with their homeland, even when they don't agree with some of the political ideas in the country. But it doesn't mean that they want that a third country bomb Cuba.
I want to ask you who Cuba's friends are at this moment. Who's helping Cuba weather this stormy time? So Ecuador and Costa Rica have cut off diplomatic relations with Cuba. Honduras, Guatemala, Jamaica, Guyana, and Paraguay have ended their use of medical brigades, doctors from Cuba. We've seen Mexico and Brazil send aid, but not oil, to Cuba. Who do you count as a close friend of Cuba at this moment when there is so much scrutiny of the island country by the United States?
Well, as an ambassador at the UN, I can tell you that we count with the support of the majority of the countries all over around the world.
You're hearing that from other ambassadors?
Not only here. We have a statement of the G77 and China condemning this policy. G77 and China is the largest group of member states in the UN, 134 countries.
Are you disappointed China isn't doing more? They're sending solar equipment, for instance, but do you wish that they would take a stronger stand?
Not at all. We have been receiving political support for the majority of the country, but at the same time, we have receiving some other support from many countries. You mentioned China, Vietnam, Mexico, Russia, Brazil, Chile, there are the Caribbean countries. The UN system is also working now to try to implement this when a country offers some kind of aid. They are trying to be like a bridge in order to try to avoid that the US government punish those governments. And the rest of the country, like the Mexican country, the president, Claudia Sheinbaum, said that they are working also with the US government in order to try a solution, to find a solution to export oil to Cuba. So I can tell you that and right now in Cuba, we have what they call our America Convoy, which is hundreds of people from many countries, Solidarian people from many countries, that they are arriving in Cuba since yesterday till tomorrow, bringing with them thousands of tons of aid. So Cuba is a country that has offered a lot of solidarity.
You don't feel alone
or
isolated?
Not at all. We are confident that we will go through this moment with the support of our friends, not at all.
What is your message to the American people at this moment? As we hear, again, the president making bellicose statements from the White House, what would you say to American people who are watching this and hearing from the administration that things are bound to change in Cuba in the near term?
Well, yesterday I read a poll that said that only 28% of the American people support this kind of policy of their government towards Cuba. So I will say to the rest, the 72% that doesn't support this policy, that please continues pushing, continues raising your voice in favor of a different kind of relation between Cuba and the U.S. It is possible, and it is beneficial for both parties.
Lastly, what gives you optimism that this will be resolved? How grave is this moment, and what gives you optimism that this is going to resolve itself in a way that will be peaceable?
Because this is not the first time that we face a situation like this. We have been, unfortunately, we have been facing this kind of policy for many years. I lost the count of how many presidents of the U.S. tried to change the government in Cuba, and we are still here. And as I told you, for us, there is only one option: resist and to keep and to prove that it is possible to be different. We are not better, we are not worse than the U.S. government or than the U.S. people. We are just different people. We just want to try to build our own future from our own perspective. And we are ready. We have relations with the overwhelming majority of the countries all over around the world. You know, we have just this kind of relation with the U.S., Israel, and now those two countries that you mentioned before, that it's show that it's a proof of capitulation, because they are acting unilaterally, arbitrarily, and without any reason. But we are people that we know how to build good relations. We know how to help each other, and that's why if you have this kind of history, and if you have this kind of, everybody in the UN, tell me, keep fighting. Don't give up. You are an example. So if you have this, you have not any doubt that you are in a right way.